75% of the Kitavan people in Papua New Guinea smoke tobacco. Their cancer rate, virtually zero. Sit on that for a moment because it breaks everything you think you know and everything I was taught in my medical training at university about smoking and cancer. I'm Dr. Abs. I've been in aesthetic and longevity medicine for over a decade. I'm qualified in sports nutrition. I'm a consultant in biotech research, teaching all around the world. And I'm also a part of the Royal Society for Public Health here in the UK. And today, I'm going to show you why the question isn't, does smoking cause cancer? It's, does smoking correlate with cancer depending on the metabolic status of the individual? Now, before we go any further, I do want to be absolutely clear. I am not telling anyone to smoke. Smoking is harmful. It damages your lungs, your cardiovascular system, your DNA. What I am going to do is follow the science into a place a lot of people are afraid to look because it might just change how we think about cancer itself. Because we all get told that it's harmful, smoking's harmful, but then at the same time we see people who smoke sometimes live extremely long lives with no medical problems too. And I think I can show you why that is in this video. By the end of this video, you'll understand the metabolic theory of cancer. Potentially, why some heavy smokers have no cancer, why the Japanese smoking paradox baffles epidemiologists, and what 7,000 chemicals in commercial cigarettes have to do with all of it. Let's start with what we all agree on. In 1964, the US Surgeon General published a landmark report linking cigarette smoking to lung cancer. That report changed public health forever. And rightly so. The data was overwhelming. Smokers were dying of lung cancer at rates that non-smokers simply were not. And since then, every credible medical institution on earth, including my own medical training at university, has reinforced that message. Smoking causes cancer. Full stop. I think that statement needs refining. Here's the thing that nobody talks about. Roughly 10 to 15% of smokers develop lung cancer. That means 85 to 90% of lifelong smokers never get lung cancer at all. Now, does that mean smoking is safe? Absolutely not. Smokers die of heart disease, COPD, stroke, a whole catalogue of disease. But the cancer question specifically, I think it's far more nuanced than a simple cause and effect, right? If X causes Y, then it means that doing X brings about Y in 100% of cases. Sprinting as hard as you can causes you to be out of breath. Simple. Doing X causes Y in every instance. But if smoking caused cancer, then we would have cancer in 100% of smokers. But do we? You see, this nuance is exactly where interesting science lives. Because if smoking were a sufficient cause of cancer on its own, you would expect the rate to be 100%. The fact it isn't tells us something important. Context matters. In 1989, a Swedish physician and researcher named Stefan Lindeberg traveled to Kitava Island, part of the Trobriand Islands in Papua New Guinea, to study a population that essentially had zero contact with Western food. What he found there would go on to challenge some of the most fundamental assumptions in modern medicine. And I have to give credit to author Anita Tagore, who is one of the co-authors of the book Why Vegans Have Smaller Brains and How Cows Reverse Climate Change, who first told me about this guy when I interviewed her on my podcast. So the Kitavan people eat a diet composed of zero processed food. No refined sugar, no seed oils, no wheat, nothing from a packet or a tin or any kind of factory. And here's the part that should make every oncologist sit up and pay attention. Despite the fact that approximately 75% of them smoke tobacco, Lindeberg found virtually zero cancer in this population. Not low rates of cancer, essentially none. So let me repeat that. 3/4 of these people smoke, and they have no cancer, no cardiovascular disease, no obesity, no diabetes, and no stroke. Lindeberg published these findings across multiple papers, and yet, and this is extraordinary, there's only one video on all of YouTube that even mentions the Kitava study that I could find. One, with 7,700 views, made 9 years ago. No clinicians covered this for some reason. Now you might be thinking, well, maybe they don't live long enough to develop cancer. That's a very fair question. But Lindeberg specifically studied the age demographics and found Catawbans living well into their 70s and 80s with no signs of the degenerative diseases we consider normal in the West. The absence of cancer wasn't because they were dying young. It was because something about their metabolic environment was protective / preventive. And I also want to give a shout out to someone else here. Her name is Mary Ruddock. She has spent possibly more time than anyone in the world studying indigenous tribes. And when they live without processed food and eat pretty much as our ancestors did, there is no obesity, no autism, no autoimmune problems, no mental health issues, no heart attacks, and no cancer. Their diet produces a metabolic profile that's essentially the opposite of the modern Western body. Low fasting insulin and no metabolic syndrome. And that, as we're about to see, may or may not be the single most important variable in whether smoking leads to cancer. If the cadaver data were the only anomaly, you might argue it's an isolated case, a genetic outlier, a small population, an artifact, whatever. But it's not the only anomaly, right? Japan presents us with the same puzzle on a national scale. For decades, Japan had some of the highest smoking rates in the developed world. In the 1960s, over 80% of Japanese men smoked, apparently. And yet, their rates of lung cancer were dramatically lower than in Western countries with similar or even lower smoking rates. This is known in epidemiology as the Japanese smoking paradox, and it's generated enormous debate. Some researchers have attributed it to genetics, others have pointed to the type of tobacco smoked in Japan, but there's one variable that keeps surfacing in the literature. It's the one that ties the whole picture together in my personal view, and that's diet. The traditional Japanese diet is very low in processed food, low in refined sugar, and rich in omega-3 fatty acids. Sound similar? It's the same metabolic profile we saw in cadaver. And here is what makes this so compelling. As Japan adopted Western dietary patterns, more processed food, more sugar, more seed oils, their cancer rates began to climb, even as their smoking rates were falling. The correlation wasn't with tobacco, it was with metabolic dysfunction. And we also need to talk about the man whose work ties all of this together, Thomas Seyfried. He is a professor of biology at Boston College. He spent the last 2 decades building a case that cancer is fundamentally a metabolic disease, not a genetic one. And that's a big claim. And it goes against the dominant paradigm in oncology, which holds that cancer is caused by random mutations in DNA, the somatic mutation theory. Seyfried doesn't deny that mutations exist in cancer cells. What he argues is that those mutations are a downstream consequence of metabolic dysfunction, not the original cause. See, after my undergraduate degree in dentistry, I went on, as a postgraduate, to study multiple other programs, including nutrition, anti-aging medicine, and also metabolic medicine. And with all of those strings to my bow, I think his work is fantastic and warrants much more study for the good of, well, all of us. The foundation of Seyfried's argument is something called the Warburg effect, named after Otto Warburg, who won the Nobel Prize in 1931 for discovering that cancer cells generate energetic currency differently from normal cells. Normal cells primarily use their mitochondria, the power stations of the cell, to produce a sort of energetic currency through a process called oxidative phosphorylation. Cancer cells, even when oxygen is available, rely heavily on a much more primitive process called fermentation, specifically the fermentation of glucose and glutamine. Now, I'm not going to go into why or how here, as that's a whole video by itself. But we know for a fact that this is true ever since the early 20th century. In fact, Warburg himself believed this metabolic shift was the origin of cancer. He argued that damage to mitochondria first and cancer follows. Seyfried's taken that further with decades of modern evidence, arguing that when mitochondria are damaged, whether by chronic inflammation, free radical damage, environmental toxins, or metabolic dysfunction, the cell's forced to rely on fermentation. And it's that fermentation-dependent state that drives the genetic instability that we see in tumors. Some of you may have seen Thomas Seyfried on the Diary of a CEO podcast. That episode has over 9 million views, which tells you that the appetite for this information is enormous. But here's what even that interview didn't fully explore: the implications for the smoking question. Pay very close attention to what I'm about to say. If seafood is right and the evidence is mounting, then the question of whether any carcinogen causes cancer is inseparable from the metabolic state of the person exposed to it. A possible carcinogen entering a metabolically healthy body with fully functional mitochondria, robust endogenous antioxidant defenses, and low systemic inflammation may behave completely differently from the same possible carcinogen entering a body that's already metabolically compromised. And that reframe changes everything, because it means that cancer prevention isn't just about avoiding possible carcinogens, it's about maintaining the metabolic health of your cells. And if you don't believe me, guess what happens when you take cancerous tissue, keep the supposedly cancerous genes in place, and replace only the mitochondria. Yeah. That experiment has already been done. The tissue flips from being cancerous to non-cancerous with no chemotherapy or drugs or high-dose vitamin C or IV drips or supplements or nonsense juice cleanses, etc., etc. There's another piece of this puzzle that almost nobody discusses properly, and it's the distinction between commercial tobacco and natural traditional tobacco leaf. A commercial cigarette, the kind that you buy in a shop, is not just tobacco. It contains over 7,000 identified chemicals, of which at least 70 are known possible carcinogens. We're talking about formaldehyde, benzene, arsenic, cadmium, acetaldehyde, nitrosamines, right? This is a chemical cocktail that should, and I'm sure would, make a toxicologist's hair stand on end. Now, when the Ketogenic smoke, they're not smoking Marlboro. They are smoking natural tobacco leaf, hand-prepared, with none of the industrial additives, accelerants, the burn rate modifiers, and even flavor chemicals that are standard in commercial cigarettes. That's a really critical distinction that gets lost in the public health conversation. And this is something that I'm really passionate about as someone that's a part of the Royal Society for Public Health here in the UK. We try and raise awareness about these things as much as we can. And one of the most liked comments I found in my research for this video, I think it was like 14,000 likes on the, I think, MedCram channel, was someone pointing out that nicotine is not nicotinic acid. And the replies are full of people, desperate for someone to properly explain the difference between nicotine as a compound, commercial tobacco as a product, and a traditional tobacco leaf as a plant. I don't think anyone's done this clearly on YouTube that I could find. Maybe if I just wasn't looking hard enough, then I take it back, of course. But start with nicotine. Let's be precise. Nicotine itself, while it's addictive and not without risks, is not classified as a carcinogen. The theoretical carcinogenic effects of smoking are primarily attributed to the combustion byproducts and the chemical additives in commercial cigarettes. When you remove the industrial processing and the thousands of added chemicals, you have a fundamentally different exposure profile. Does that make traditional tobacco safe? No. Combustion of any organic material produces harmful compounds. We know this. But the dose and chemical complexity are on entirely different scales. And when you combine traditional tobacco use with a metabolically pristine diet, as some native tribes do, now you begin to understand why the outcomes look so different. So let's bring all this together, because I think we now have enough pieces to construct a coherent theory. One that I can't find at least huge numbers of examples of here on YouTube, unless you're watching this on Instagram. So here's the argument. Smoking is harmful. Nobody's disputing that, including me. The combustion products in tobacco smoke cause free radical damage, DNA damage, chronic inflammation, you name it. These are real biological harms. But, and this is the critical insight, those harms don't occur in a vacuum. It seems that they occur inside a body that is either metabolically resilient or metabolically compromised. And the difference in outcomes appears to be, enormous. In a metabolically healthy body, one with functional mitochondria, low chronic inflammation, good insulin responses, and adequate micronutrient status, the damage from smoking may be substantially mitigated by the body's own repair mechanisms. DNA repair pathways work efficiently. Damaged cells are cleared through apoptosis. The immune system identifies and eliminates precancerous cells before they can establish themselves. In a metabolically dysfunctional body, one fueled by processed garbage, high carbohydrates, chronically inflamed, physiologically insulin resistant, damaged mitochondria, those same repair mechanisms they're already overwhelmed. Add on top of that a possibly carcinogenic exposure like smoking, and now you have a system that can't cope. And so the damage accumulates, the dysfunctions pile up, and potentially cancer takes hold. This is what I call the metabolic context theory of smoking and cancer. It doesn't say smoking is safe. It says the metabolic environment of the host is arguably the most important variable in determining whether a possibly carcinogenic exposure leads to cancer. And the evidence from Kitava, from Japan, from Siegfried's metabolic research, from Otto Warburg, all points in the same direction. Now, I could be completely wrong, of course. When I started studying metabolic medicine at university as a postgrad, even the tutors had no idea of things like the Warburg effect or that large populations of smoke never got cancer in some instances. I felt like I was wasting my time, frankly. But if I'm wrong, then I'd love to see the evidence for it too. But so far, we have evidence like that on screen now, which showed that if you take an existing tumor and change nothing but the mitochondria, the cells aren't cancerous anymore. I think we should be discussing things like this much more often, to be honest. And if I'm not mistaken, this is actually a paper that I've taught in my online school to help you understand what happens in your body to cause these sorts of problems to occur, so that you can make decisions to be as healthy and good looking for as long as possible. If you're interested, there's a link in the description below, because frankly, you're not going to get taught papers like this in school or university anywhere. And I want to change that. All right, so what do you actually do with this information in this video? Because I know some of you are watching this and thinking, great, does this mean I can smoke if I eat well? No. Let me be unambiguous about that. What this information means is that metabolic health is not just relevant to cancer prevention, in my personal opinion. It may be the single most important factor. And that should change how you prioritize your health decisions. If you smoke, the best thing you can do is stop. That hasn't changed. But the joint best thing you can do, and this applies, whether you smoke or not, is to fix your metabolic health. Because the same metabolic dysfunction that appears to amplify cancer rates from smoking is also implicated in cancer that has nothing to do with smoking, from a lot of the work that we can see from Professor Siegfried. And as a longevity medicine advocate and a certified sports nutritionist, here's what I focus on with my patients. Number one, eliminate ultra-processed food and carbohydrates as much as possible. It's not a suggestion, it's the single highest impact dietary change you can make. And in fact, I know Professor Siegfried would agree with me. Ultra-processed food is full of crap, and repeated dietary carbohydrates drive physiological insulin resistance, chronic inflammation, and mitochondrial dysfunction. It's the metabolic equivalent of pouring petrol on a fire. And number two, prioritize essential nutrients with no anti-nutrients alongside. My diet, for example, is very low to no carb. And I have next to no anti-nutrients in there too. This includes things like lectins, cyanogenic glycosides, and much more. Foods that support mitochondrial function rather than destroying it is what I want. And eating outside of this isn't reversed in its effects by taking magic supplements either. There's no cheat code, right? I personally don't take any regular supplements at all. I have a nutraceutical drink called a Nutricos, for example, but it's not a supplement. I take that because it's the only drink in the world that's been shown to make your body produce multiple collagen types, elastin and fibronectin, all at the same time. I'll leave a link to it in the description if you want to see it. Number three, move and build muscle mass. Exercise is one of the most powerful interventions we have for mitochondrial health. It stimulates mitochondrial biogenesis, which is the creation of new and healthy mitochondria, and it improves normal insulin response. The priority that I work with for my patients is resistance training to build muscle mass and high-intensity interval training to build cardiovascular health. I never, ever advocate prolonged moderate intensity cardio. I have other videos on this channel explaining why, if you're interested too, so I won't go into it here. But number 4, and this is the one that might surprise you. Question the narrative. Not to become a conspiracy theorist, but to become a more sophisticated thinker about your health. The relationship between smoking and cancer is real, but it's more complex than a poster slogan. And if we can understand that complexity, we can make better decisions, not just about smoking, but also about every aspect of our metabolic health. I highly recommend you read a book called Cancer as a Metabolic Disease by Professor Seyfried. It's very technical, but if you're willing to put the effort in, you'll learn a lot from it. Also look at Food and Western Disease by Stefan Lindberg and Nutrition and Physical Degeneration by Weston Price. The single most book that I've ever read in my entire life. Now, I want to end with something important. This video is an exploration of published scientific research. It's not medical advice. It's not an endorsement of smoking in any form. Smoking is harmful. If you smoke, please speak with your doctor about cessation. What I've tried to do today is present evidence that complicates a simple narrative, and not to undermine public health, but to expand our understanding of cancer as a metabolic disease. The research from Lindberg, Seyfried, Warburg, and all the epidemiological data from Japan all point toward a conclusion that mainstream medicine has been slow to embrace, that the metabolic environment of the host may be more important as a determinant of cancer risk. Here's why I set up my online school. I can't see anyone else teaching scientific papers like this. If this video made you think differently about cancer, about metabolic health, or about the questions we should be asking in medicine, save it. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want to go deeper into any of the studies I've referenced today, you won't regret it.